How long do you like your games? Well, that depends primarily on two things: how much time you have and how many games you have. That you want to play, of course. I should probably start by putting my personal preference out there, which is that I don't mind a lot of my games being shorter. Look, I get the appeal of games taking longer. You get more for your money, and who can argue with that? Plus, if you're enjoying a game, then it only makes sense that you would want more of it. But here's the thing, if a game is done well, then I find myself being satisfied with the experience no matter what. Plus, I've found that shorter games are often more approachable to run through again anyway, since the time commitment isn't as demanding. And then what about games that are short but pretty difficult to complete? AKA, a whole bunch of games from the 8 and 16-bit eras. I'd almost argue that the length of games like that is irrelevant, and here's why. Those games are designed all around the idea that you're going to play through them a bunch, playing through most of the stages multiple times. So how do you determine the length of a game like that? I suppose the best you could say is how long it takes to go from the first stage through the last, assuming you're good enough to progress through them. But even if you beat it, I'd argue it's just as enjoyable to run through the game again as it was the time before. I mean, it's not like you really play these games for story like you would for a more modern game. And yes, I understand there's games from the 8 and 16-bit generations with substantial stories, and on the flip side, more modern games where the story isn't very important. Anyways, once the stories in games became more prevalent, I think the length of a game is much easier to define. You can't just run through the entirety of a game like this in one sitting. It often takes multiple days, if not weeks or even months. Because of this, there's a sense of completion when you reach the end of the game, combined with finding out how the story of the game concludes. Alright, so now that we've discussed some of the factors that go into determining the length of a game, let's talk about what's ideal. Like anything, answers are definitely going to vary from person to person, and I would also think that while many gamers may tend to gravitate to games of a certain length, I'm sure most people still play games of all sorts of different lengths, even if they may prefer one kind. I think the biggest potential deal breaker for gamers is obviously going to be games that are too long. I've certainly heard people talk about how they won't play these super long adventure games, no matter how good they've heard they are. I mean, those games are going to take up a huge chunk of the year to complete. So you gotta really want to finish that game and be able to finish it for it to be worth it. Remember that video where I talked about backlogs and how gamers struggle to finish their games? Well, the longer a game is, the more likely you are to get distracted by other games and never finish it. Okay, so we've talked about the length of a game overall, but I think it's important to talk about an aspect of game length that may be even more important, and that would be the amount of time a game demands per sitting. Basically, how much time do you need for it to be worth sitting down with the game? Now, this is an interesting comparison to the overall length of a game because I feel like they're almost inversely related. Games that are longer overall can generally be played in short bursts because they often have pretty robust save features where you can save your game often and in some cases at any time you want. I understand that if it's a long engrossing game, you're gonna have to eventually play the game for some longer periods of time if you're ever going to get through it, but you have the option every time you sit down to play for either a little while or a long while, and that's convenient. Games that are shorter overall in length can often require huge chunks of time to play because they tend to have more limited save features, if any save feature at all. What can compound this is when games are really difficult on top of having unlimited continues. I mean, just look at the Ghouls and Ghosts games. It can require a super long sitting to beat one of these. Because of this, I remember back in the day kids just leaving their console turned on, even while they were at school, overnight, or what have you, and sure enough, you'd come back to your console to find that your parents had conveniently turned the console off for you. All your hard work gone. They just didn't get it, did they? Nowadays, these mini consoles all have save features built in, and it's hard to argue with the convenience of stuff like that. In any case, these are my thoughts on a game's length, and as always, I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are. Do you have a preference for a game's length? Or do you just play what looks best overall and worry about finding the time for them once you actually sit down to play them? So let us know in the comments, and I will see ya in the next video. Hey, one more thing. I wanted to mention that I now have a Patreon page, and so if you're looking to support the channel, I've got a link to my page in the description box. At the time of this video, all patrons will be able to vote from a list of choices for what video topics they'd like to see me cover next. You'll be able to do this regardless of pledge amount, and just remember that every dollar helps. So thank you for watching, and again, I will see ya in the next video.